Daniel Hayes was not like most 17-year-olds. While others his age were glued to glowing phone screens, chasing fleeting trends, or worrying about who they would ask to prom, Daniel spent his evenings lying in tall Montana grass, watching the horizon through the scope of a rifle. He wasn't chasing deer for trophies, nor trying to impress anyone. For him, hunting was something different in exercise, in patience, focus, and stillness. He had grown up in a world where silence spoke louder than words, and every breath carried weight. Montana's wild landscapes shaped him long before the Army ever would. His father, a ranch hand hardened by decades of labor, taught him the basics of shooting when he was barely tall enough to shoulder a rifle. His mother worried endlessly, saying the boy was too young to be handling such responsibility. But his father insisted it wasn't about hunting. It was about discipline. "Out here, Danny," his father would say, "a man learns quick that mistakes have consequences. A bad shot means no food, and no food means hunger. Focus is survival." By the time Daniel turned 12, he could drop a moving target at distances that shocked grown hunters. Local men often joked he had eagle eyes, though Daniel never smiled when praised. Accuracy didn't feel like talent to him. It felt like the result of hours spent lying still, feeling the wind shift against his cheek, learning when to wait and when to pull. His mother often found him sitting outside long after sunset, the rifle resting beside him, eyes fixed on the tree line. She worried that her son's quietness wasn't normal for his age, but she couldn't deny he was different. At school, Daniel was an outsider. He wasn't bullied, but he wasn't popular either. He spoke little, didn't play sports, and preferred the sound of crickets over the roar of a Friday night crowd. Teachers called him serious in their reports, sometimes even distant. But beneath the stillness was a storm. He was restless, searching for something bigger than the small town he had grown up in. That search found direction the day Army recruiters came to his high school. They set up a booth in the gym, polished, boots gleaming, handing out pamphlets filled with bold slogans about honor, duty, and brotherhood. While his classmates laughed at the idea of enlisting, Daniel lingered. He listened closely as one recruiter, a broad-shouldered sergeant with a scar down his cheek, explained the path of a sniper. The sergeant described the training, the precision, the patience, and above all, the responsibility. "One man, one shot, can change the course of a mission," the recruiter said, eyes scanning the room. "Not everyone's built for it. But some of you, maybe one of you, has what it takes." Daniel felt something stir in his chest that day. It wasn't excitement or pride, it was recognition. For the first time, someone had described his life's discipline in a way that made sense. Hunting deer in the Montana woods, he had never missed. But what if that skill meant more? What if it could protect lives instead of taking them? That night, Daniel brought the pamphlet home. His father barely looked up from the table when Daniel laid it down. "The Army, huh?" he muttered, chewing slowly. "That's no gain, son. You go down that road, you don't come back the same." His mother reacted differently, panic flashing in her eyes, her hand tightening around Daniel's. "You're still a child," she whispered. 17 isn't old enough to carry a gun in a war." But Daniel wasn't convinced he was still a child. He had lived with responsibility all his life, on the ranch, in the woods, within himself. He explained, in his quiet way, that this was what he was meant for. That his patience, his stillness, his discipline, they weren't just hobbies. They were tools waiting to be used. It took weeks of debate, arguments late into the night, and countless tears from his mother before his parents signed the consent forms. The day he officially enlisted, Daniel felt no surge of joy, no rush of adrenaline. Instead, he felt a calm, certainty, as though he had finally stepped onto the path he was always meant to walk. Basic training was a shock to his body, if not to his mind. The endless running, push-ups, and drills strained his muscles, but the discipline demanded by the Army suited him perfectly. While others cracked under the shouting of drill sergeants, Daniel stood unflinching, eyes forward. Fellow recruits mocked him relentlessly at first. His baby face made him look more like a freshman than a soldier. They nicknamed him Boy Scout and Junior, but the ridicule only fueled his silence. Daniel wasn't there to prove himself with words. He would let his rifle speak. That moment came sooner than anyone expected. During the first marksmanship trials, recruits lined up at the range, rifles shaking nervously in their hands. Targets popped up at varying distances. Some recruits barely hit the silhouettes at 50 yards. Daniel, however, was different. His breathing slowed, his body grew still, and one by one, his shots rang out, each bullet striking clean, centered, and precise. Instructors paused, murmuring to one another as they checked the targets. Every single one was flawless. The laughter from his fellow recruits died that day. No one called him Junior anymore. Instead, they watched him carefully, whispering that the kid didn't miss. For Daniel, it wasn't about impressing anyone. He had no interest in proving himself to men who didn't understand him. What mattered was that the Army had given him a place where his silence was not weakness, but strength, where his patience was not odd, but essential. For the first time, Daniel felt seen not as a quiet boy from Montana, but as a soldier with purpose. Yet behind that calm exterior, something lingered. A question. Could he translate skill from the hunting fields of Montana to the brutal chaos of war? Could he hold the same steady aim when it wasn't a deer in scope, but another human being? The answer, he knew, would come soon enough. That was the boy who left Montana at 17. Not the strongest, not the loudest, not the most confident, but the one who could wait longer, breathe steadier, and shoot straighter than anyone else. And though no one knew it then, the quiet recruit mocked for his youth would soon carve his name into the pages of United States military history with a single shot that shattered records and turned him into legend. The first weeks of basic training were designed to break men down. For most recruits, it worked. The endless marshes, blistering runs in desert heat, and the constant roar of drill sergeants stripped away whatever comfort they had known back home. For Daniel Hayes, though, it was less about surviving the shouting and more about learning to breathe through it. He wasn't immune to exhaustion. His legs burned, his shoulders ached under the weight of his pack, and his body cried for rest. But unlike others, he never let the pain show. He had spent years in Montana trudging through snow with his father, carrying gear heavier than his frame should have allowed. Endurance wasn't new to him. It was second nature. Other recruits quickly noticed he wasn't like them. At 17, his face was too smooth, his voice too soft. Many of them were 20, 21, even 24 men who had lived lives, worked jobs, and kissed girlfriends goodbye before shipping off. To them, Daniel was a boy playing soldier. They laughed when he fumbled with boots too big, or when he struggled to keep up with military jargon he had never heard before. "Hey, Junior," one recruit snorted one morning as Daniel adjusted his helmet strap. "Did Mommy pack your lunch today?" Laughter rippled through the barracks. Daniel said nothing. He simply finished adjusting, then sat quietly, lacing his boots. His silence was mistaken for weakness. What they didn't realize was that Daniel had long ago learned the power of holding back words. In the Montana woods, noise meant scaring. Off game, stillness and patience had always been his allies. He carried that same stillness into the Army. It wasn't long before instructors noticed. While some recruits lost focus under pressure, Daniel stood steady. When others complained during grueling drills, he marched silently. His body wasn't the strongest, but his discipline was unmatched. A moment that began to separate him came on the firing range. The range was the true test, where rifles cracked in succession, echoing across the training grounds. Targets were set at varying distances, challenging recruits to adjust, aim, and fire. Many missed completely, their nerves making their hands shake. Others hit poorly, bullets tearing ragged holes in the outer rings. When it was Daniel's turn, he approached the line quietly. His rifle felt familiar, like an extension of his own body. He dropped to prone position, his cheek settling naturally against the stock. He closed one eye, slowed his breathing, and waited. He wasn't thinking about impressing anyone. He wasn't even thinking about the target. He was listening to the rhythm of his lungs, to the faint whistle of the wind, to the pause between heartbeats. Crack. The first shot hit dead center. He reloaded without looking up. Crack. Another center hit. By the fifth shot, the instructors had stopped watching. The other recruits, they were watching Daniel. Every bullet he fired found the bullseye. Not once did he flinch. Not once did he miss. When his magazine was empty, he set the rifle down and waited quietly for the next command. One instructor muttered, "That kid doesn't miss." From that day forward, whispers followed him. Some recruits resented him even more, their jealousy. Sharp, beginner's luck, they sneered. Let's see him do it again tomorrow. And he did, every single day. The Army didn't hand out praise easily, but Daniel's consistency couldn't be ignored. He was soon pulled aside for specialized evaluation. A grizzled sergeant named Miller, a veteran sniper himself, watched him fire with a calculating eye. Miller wasn't interested in raw accuracy. Alone anyone could get lucky a few times. What he wanted to see was control under pressure. He tested Daniel in ways others hadn't been. The targets were moved farther away, hidden behind obstacles, peering for only a few seconds at a time. The wind was deliberately disturbed by fans. Other recruits watching failed miserably under the setup. Daniel, though, didn't panic. He waited, breathed, and fired when the moment was right. The bullets landed true. Sergeant Miller approached afterward, eyes narrowed. "You've got a gift," he said simply. "But gifts aren't enough. Out there, one mistake costs lives. You want to be a sniper? You've got to prove you can wait. Waiting is the hardest part. The next weeks were the true crucible. Daniel was put through tests that broke the will of older, stronger men. He spent hours belly crawling through mud, his rifle clutched above the muck, while instructors searched for him with binoculars. If they spotted so much as a blade of grass move unnaturally, he failed. Daniel learned to move like a shadow, inch by inch, his breathing shallow, his muscles screaming, until he could get within firing position unnoticed. Night after night, he practiced camouflage, painting his face, weaving branches into his uniform, blending into trees until even other recruits stepped past him without realizing he was there. His patience was infinite. Hours passed with him, lying completely still, body aching, but mind calm. Where others fidgeted, scratched, or broke focus, Daniel seemed content in the silence. It wasn't all triumph. He made mistakes everyone did. Once, while crawling through tall grass during an exercise, his rifle barrel caught on a twig. An instructor spotted the slight jerk and blew the whistle, failing him instantly. Daniel said nothing, but that night he practiced moving through grass again and again until every inch of his crawl was flawless. Failure didn't frustrate him. It fueled him. The turning point came during the psychological endurance test, where recruits were placed under simulated battlefield stress. Sirens blared, instructors shouted, and explosions shook the ground. The task was simple: hit the target under pressure. Many recruits missed entirely, overwhelmed by the chaos. Daniel, however, shut it all out. His breathing slowed, his focus narrowed, and the target was all he saw. The crack of his rifle cut through the noise, and the round found its mark perfectly. Instructors exchanged glances. Few men, let alone boys, had that kind of composure. By the time sniper school concluded, Daniel wasn't the joke of the barracks anymore. He was the one others looked at with a mixture of awe and unease. He was. Still quiet, still serious, still the youngest in the room, but he had earned something few could: respect. When graduation day arrived, he stood in formation, the sniper's insignia freshly pinned to his uniform. Other recruits cheered, smiling, proud of their achievement. Daniel didn't smile. He simply looked ahead, eyes steady, as though already preparing for what came next. For him, this wasn't the end of training. It was the beginning of the real test. Combat loomed, and Daniel knew skills on a firing range meant little compared to the chaos of a battlefield. The army had given him tools. Now, war would ask the ultimate question. Could he use them when it mattered most? The 17-year-old recruit, who once hunted silently in Montana fields, had transformed. He was no longer mocked, no longer doubted. He was a soldier, a marksman, and soon he would become something more. What no one in that graduation formation knew was that history was waiting for him. A single shot, one impossible, legendary shot, would one day make the world remember his name. The air in Afghanistan carried a weight Daniel had never felt before. It wasn't just the heat, though the desert sun scorched everything it touched. It wasn't just the dust, though fine particles coated his skin and filled his lungs with every breath. It was something heavier, something invisible, the presence of danger. For weeks after arriving, he felt it pressing on him. The base hummed with nervous energy, radios buzzing with chatter of enemy movements, convoys rolling out, and returning battered. Even at 17, Daniel sensed war was not about glory or medals. It was about survival. The first mission came quicker than expected. His unit was tasked with patrolling a narrow valley where insurgents were rumored to move weapons. Intelligence suggested ambushes were common there. For most recruits, the news spread fear. For Daniel, it sparked something different: calm preparation. He checked his rifle over and over, ensuring every bolt clicked into place, every scope adjustment worked flawlessly. As the convoy rolled out, the Humvee rattled beneath him. Dust clouds rose behind the tires, and the mountains loomed like watchful giants. Soldiers around him joked nervously, trying to mask their fear. Daniel sat silently, eyes scanning ridgelines. He wasn't listening to the chatter. He was listening to the silence of the valley itself. The silence broke with the crack of gunfire. The first shots came from high above. Bullets clanged off armored doors, ricocheting with terrifying force. Men shouted, ducking, scrambling for cover. Dust exploded around them as enemy rounds dug into the earth. "Ambush, ridgeline, east side," a sergeant barked. Daniel's heart pounded, but his hands were steady. He swung from the Humvee, crawling to a rock formation for cover. He raised his scope. Through the glass, he spotted the faint glint of metal, an enemy sniper hidden among the rocks. The world seemed to slow. His breathing steadied. Inhale, exhale, pause. He remembered Montana winters, lying in snowbanks waiting for deer to step into view. Only this time, it wasn't a deer. It was a man aiming to kill his brothers. Crack, a shot echoed, cutting through the chaos. Through the scope, he saw the enemy collapse, rifle tumbling from lifeless hands. The ridgeline went momentarily quiet. "Sniper down. Move, move," his sergeant shouted. Daniel's squad surged forward, seizing the advantage. Grenades exploded along the ridge, smoke rising in violent plumes. The firefight lasted only minutes more before the insurgents retreated, their ambush shattered. When silence finally returned, the squad caught their breath. Sweat dripped, adrenaline surged, and eyes turned to Daniel. No one mocked him now. No one called him Junior. They had seen his calm under fire. They had watched a boy pull a trigger and save men twice his age. "Hell of a shot, kid," one soldier muttered, slapping his back. Daniel said nothing. He simply reloaded his rifle, eyes scanning the horizon again. The fight was over, but war never really ended. That night, back at base, the reality of what happened settled over him. He sat on his bunk, rifle propped beside him, staring at his hands. They weren't shaking. That surprised him. He had expected guilt, nausea, regret. Instead, he felt a strange stillness. He hadn't pulled the trigger out of hatred. He hadn't done it for glory. He had done it because his brothers would have died if he hadn't. The army psychologists often asked new soldiers how they processed their first kill. Some broke down, unable to reconcile the act. Some grew hardened, hiding their emotions behind bravado. Daniel simply told them the truth. "It was my job," he said quietly. Word spread quickly across the base. A 17-year-old rookie had spotted and eliminated an enemy sniper in the middle of his first firefight. Seasoned veterans shook their heads in disbelief. For them, it took months, sometimes years, to build the nerve Daniel carried naturally. Over the next missions, his reputation only grew. He never boasted, never sought attention. But in every firefight, he was there calm, patient, deadly precise. His squad began to rely on him more and more, placing him in overwatch positions whenever possible. One mission etched itself deeper into their memory. The unit was clearing a village suspected of harboring insurgents. Children peeked nervously from doorways. Women hurried inside, pulling scarves over their faces. Tension choked the air. As the squad moved down the narrow street, gunfire erupted from rooftops. Chaos exploded. Pinned down, soldiers scrambled for cover, bullets sparking against stone walls. Daniel, positioned on a rooftop at the village edge, scanned through his scope. He spotted the muzzle flash of an AK-47 in a second-story window. Inhale. Exhale. Crack. The enemy dropped. He shifted immediately, spotting another climbing to a rooftop ladder. Crack. Another body slumped. Every shot he took gave his squad space to breathe, to move, to survive. By the time the firefight ended, they had cleared the village with minimal casualties. The after-action report credited Daniel's overwatch with saving at least 5 lives. Back at base, soldiers treated him differently. The jokes were gone. In their place came respect, even reverence. Some whispered about him, calling him the Kid Ghost, because he appeared silently, struck with precision, and disappeared just as quickly. Enemies never saw him until it was too late. But Daniel didn't think of himself as a ghost. He thought of himself as a rifleman doing his job. The weight of it was real, though. Every night, he lay awake staring at the barracks ceiling, hearing echoes of gunfire in his mind. He saw faces, brief flashes of men in his scope just before the shot. He didn't celebrate the kills. He carried them, quietly, the way he carried everything else. One evening, as he cleaned his rifle in silence, Sergeant Miller, the veteran who had first noticed his gift, sat beside him. "You know, Hayes," Miller said, lighting a cigarette, "most men need years before they can keep their hands steady in combat. You've done it in weeks. That's rare." Daniel didn't answer. He simply kept cleaning, wiping carbon from the barrel. "You ever wonder why?" Miller pressed. Daniel finally spoke. "Because if I don't, someone else dies." Miller studied him, then nodded. "That's the right answer. Don't ever forget it. The shot's not about pride. It's about protection." Those words stuck with Daniel. He never sought to be legendary. He never wanted medals. All he wanted was to keep his brothers alive. Every mission, every bullet, was a promise. As weeks turned into months, his skill became undeniable. Commanders began assigning him critical overwatch roles, even against protocol, because he was still officially underage. He didn't argue. He didn't seek the assignments. He simply obeyed orders, settled into position, and waited. Waiting became his weapon. Where other soldiers fidgeted or grew restless, Daniel lay still for hours, unmoving, breathing slow, eyes fixed through the scope. He became the quiet guardian, the unseen protector, the one constant presence his squad relied on. But deep down, Daniel knew this was only the beginning. War was escalating. The missions were growing deadlier, the targets more elusive. And though his first kill had proven him, the true test had yet to come. Somewhere ahead, on a distant ridge, history was waiting for him. And when the moment arrived, Daniel Hayes would either fail or fire the single most legendary shot in U.S. military history. The desert had a way of swallowing time. Days bled into each other, marked only by the rising sun and the endless sound of boots on gravel. For Daniel Hayes, life in Afghanistan became a rhythm: patrols, firefights, brief moments of rest, then back out again. Yet within that rhythm, something else grew: his reputation. At first, his squad only whispered, "The kid doesn't miss." They muttered after missions, shaking their heads in disbelief. But soon, the whispers spread. Other platoons began asking about the 17-year-old sniper who never flinched, never lost focus, never hesitated. On the battlefield, insurgents had their own whispers. Captured radios revealed chatter about an American ghost boy. Fighters claimed he appeared from nowhere, struck unseen, and vanished again. The myth spread faster than truth, as myths often do. Some enemies even avoided ridgelines, fearing the glassy eye of his scope. Daniel himself ignored the rumors. He didn't crave the attention. For him, every mission was the same: protect. The men beside him, but his commanders took notice. Reports showed again and again how his overwatch changed the outcome of firefights. He wasn't just accurate, he was reliable. And in war, reliability was priceless. One evening, Daniel sat on the edge of his bunk, cleaning his rifle by lamplight. His hands moved in practiced motions, stripping, wiping, reassembling. Across the room, Sergeant Miller entered, his face grim. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Hayes, command wants you on a new assignment." Daniel looked up, eyes steady. "When?" "Tomorrow. Briefing at 0600. It's different this time. Bigger." The next morning, Daniel sat in a cramped tent with his squad and several officers. A large map was pinned to the wall, markers scattered across valleys and villages. At the center was a circled name: Khalid Rahman. Rahman wasn't just another fighter. He was a high-value target, an insurgent leader, orchestrating ambushes that killed dozens of American and Afghan soldiers. He was known for slipping away before strikes, using locals as shields, disappearing into the mountains. Intelligence suggested he would be moving through a valley under heavy guard within the week. Eliminating him will cripple their operations. "In this region," an officer explained, his finger stabbing the map, "we have one chance, and we're putting Hayes on overwatch." Murmurs spread through the room. Some officers frowned, clearly uneasy about assigning a teenager to such a critical role. But the colonel cut them off. "He's the best shot we've got. End of discussion." That night, Daniel lay awake in his cot, staring at the canvas ceiling. He thought about Montana fields, the quiet hunts, his father's lessons. He thought about his mother, who still believed her boy was too young to carry a rifle. And he thought about Rahman, a man who sent others to die, who planted bombs that tore through convoys, who left families shattered on both sides. He didn't think about glory. He didn't think about records. He thought about the men beside him, their laughter, their fear, their trust. If his bullet could save them, he would take the shot. 2 days later, the mission began. Daniel and his spotter, Corporal Lewis, hiked for hours across jagged terrain, carrying their gear under brutal sun. Sweat soaked their uniforms, but neither complained. Their destination was a ridge, overlooking the valley Rahman was expected to cross. By nightfall, they reached the position. They dug in, camouflaging themselves among rocks and dry brush. Daniel settled behind his rifle, adjusting the bipod, checking his scope again and again. Lewis scanned with binoculars, muttering updates quietly. "Convoy expected tomorrow morning," Lewis said. "Multiple guards. Probably armored vehicles." Daniel nodded. He said little, conserving words the way he conserved movements. His focus narrowed to the rifle, the terrain, the wind brushing across his face. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the distant howl of desert wind. At dawn, movement stirred in the valley. Through the scope, Daniel saw dust-rising vehicles approaching, men on foot flanking them. And there, among them, walked Khaled Rahman. Lewis whispered, "There he is." Range 2,300 meters. Daniel's jaw tightened. That distance was far beyond standard engagement range. Most snipers wouldn't even attempt it. The wind was shifting unpredictably, and the convoy moved slowly, weaving across the valley floor. "Too far," Lewis muttered. "Command will call it off," but Daniel's eyes stayed fixed on the target. He wasn't thinking about orders. He was calculating wind drift, bullet drop, humidity, even the Earth's rotation at that distance. His mind worked quietly, methodically, as if solving one of the countless puzzles he had faced back home in Montana fields. Over the radio, command crackled. Negative engagement. Repeat, do not attempt. Distance is outside authorized parameters. Daniel didn't respond. His breathing slowed. Inhale, exhale, pause. The world around him faded, the shouting, the wind, even the pounding of his own heart. Through the scope, only Rahman remained. Lewis hissed, "Hayes, don't!" Crack. The rifle thundered, echoing. Across the ridge. The round screamed through the air, vanishing into the distance. For 3 long seconds, nothing happened. Then Rahman stumbled mid-step. His body jerked, then collapsed to the dust. Chaos erupted and the convoy guards shouted, firing wildly into the mountains, unsure where the shot had come from. Vehicles swerved, dust rising in panicked clouds. But Daniel was already reloading, scanning for secondary threats. His face remained calm, eyes cold, movements precise. Lewis exhaled in disbelief. "Holy, you hit him. You actually hit him." Back at base, the news spread like wildfire. A 17-year-old recruit had just eliminated one of the region's most wanted insurgent leaders with a shot fired from over 2 kilometers away. Commanders confirmed the kill, stunned by the impossible range. Reports poured upward, reaching higher and higher levels until even the Pentagon took notice. For soldiers in Afghanistan, Daniel became a legend overnight. They whispered his name, with awe, some even with fear. For insurgents, he became something darker, an unseen force who could strike from distances they believed impossible. But Daniel didn't celebrate. He sat quietly on his bunk, rifle beside him as the base buzzed. With excitement. When asked how he made the shot, he simply said, "I did my job." And though he downplayed it, Daniel knew something had changed. He was no longer just the boy from Montana, the quiet recruit mocked for his youth. He was the sniper who had done the impossible. He had crossed into history with a single bullet. What none of them knew was that this was only the beginning. The shot had broken records, but it also placed a target on his back. Enemies wanted him dead. Commanders wanted to use him more. And Daniel, still only 17, carried the weight of a legend he had never asked for. The war would not let him rest. The base erupted in celebration the night the report was confirmed. Soldiers who had never spoken to Daniel crowded around his bunk, clapping his back, grinning like children around a hero. For once, the dusty, war-worn camp felt alive. Some compared the shot to legends from past wars, names whispered in sniper schools. Others declared it would be unmatched for decades. But Daniel sat quietly, hands folded on his knees, expression unchanged. He wasn't comfortable with the noise, the handshakes, the sudden spotlight. For him, the shot had not been about fame. It had been about duty, about keeping his squad alive. "Kid," Sergeant Miller said that night, dropping into the chair. Across from him, "You realize what you just did? You changed the game. That's going in the record books." Daniel shook his head slowly. "I just pulled the trigger." Miller chuckled, but his eyes held concern. He'd seen young soldiers buckle under less attention. He knew legends came with weight even grown men struggled to carry. By morning, Daniel's name was being passed along in official channels. The report of the kill traveled beyond Afghanistan, reaching U.S. command centers, then newspapers, then cable news. Within days, headlines buzzed. Teenage soldier breaks sniper record with impossible shot. The boy who became America's deadliest marksman. The Pentagon remained tight-lipped, refusing to release specifics. But reporters pieced together enough fragments to paint Daniel as a kind of mythic figure. To the American public, he became a symbol of young courage, the boy who had done what seasoned veterans hadn't. In the base mess hall, soldiers pushed their trays aside when Daniel entered. They called him Legend, Deadeye, Ghost. Some meant it with admiration, others with envy. Daniel forced a polite smile, but inside, unease twisted. He hadn't asked for any of this. At night, when the tents grew quiet, he lay awake replaying the shot in his head. Not the distance, not the math, but the man's face. Khaled Rahman had been a monster by all accounts, a killer responsible for countless deaths. Yet Daniel had ended his life with a squeeze of a finger. And though he believed it was necessary, the finality of it haunted him in still moments. Corporal Lewis, his spotter, noticed the silence. "You're in your head too much," he said one evening, tossing Daniel a ration bar. "You did what needed to be done. Don't let it eat you." Daniel nodded, but said nothing. Words rarely explained the weight pressing on his chest. What Lewis didn't know was that Daniel wasn't afraid of guilt. He was afraid of becoming. The story of being used as something he wasn't. He was just a kid who wanted to protect his team. Now he was becoming a legend in headlines and speeches. Weeks later, his squad prepared for another patrol. This time, whispers followed them like shadows. Other units pointed at Daniel, some with admiration, others with resentment. A young private muttered, "Guess we're safe. Ghost boys with us." Daniel adjusted his rifle strap, saying nothing. He didn't want his presence to feel like a shield, didn't want men to rely on myth instead of their training. On patrol, insurgents were bolder now. The record shot had made Daniel infamous among enemies. Leaflets appeared in villages with crude drawings of a young soldier, a bounty scribbled beneath. Locals whispered warnings. The Taliban wanted the ghost boy's head. For Daniel's commanders, this was a double-edged sword. His reputation inspired American troops, boosting morale in a region drowning in fear. But it also made him a target, and they knew every mission carried greater risk now. "Hayes," Captain Donovan told him after a briefing, You've become an asset and a liability. We'll be rotating you more carefully. No unnecessary risks. Daniel only nodded. Orders were orders, but deep down he felt the shift. He wasn't just another soldier anymore. He was a weapon, a symbol, a story being told by people who didn't know him. One night, his squad sat around a fire, laughing, swapping stories about home. Someone nudged Daniel. "Come on, legend, tell us what it was like. That shot." Daniel hesitated. The firelight flickered across their eager faces, waiting. Slowly, he shook his head. It was just another mission. The group groaned, disappointed, but Daniel stayed quiet. He refused to glorify death. To him, silence honored the reality of it far better than stories. Still, he couldn't stop the world from telling its version. Weeks later, a visiting journalist managed to interview his commanders, piecing together enough details to publish a feature story. The headline read, "America's Youngest Sniper Hero, the Montana Prodigy." Daniel saw the paper weeks after, folded on a table in the command tent. His face wasn't pictured, only a shadowy silhouette with a rifle butt. The words made him sick. Hero, prodigy. He didn't feel like either. That night, Sergeant Miller found him cleaning his rifle again, hands moving faster than usual. "You're angry," Miller said. Daniel shrugged. "They make it sound like a game, like it's something to cheer for. People need hope." Miller replied quietly, "They need symbols. Doesn't mean you asked for it, but that's what you've become. The trick is not letting it change you." Daniel stared at the rifle, the tool that had made him infamous. He thought of home again, of his mother hanging laundry in the backyard, his father teaching him to breathe steady while hunting deer. He wondered if they knew what the papers are saying, if they recognized the boy in the headlines. As the weeks turned into months, Daniel's missions grew more dangerous. Commanders trusted his skill, but he noticed something unsettling. They began to depend on him more, pushing him into positions no one else would dare attempt. It wasn't just his ability, they were using the myth. If Daniel was present, soldiers fought harder, morale soared. One operation ended with soldiers chanting his nickname as they marched back into base. Daniel walked among them silently, his face unreadable, but his mind restless. He couldn't escape the truth. The legend had grown larger than the boy. Enemies hunted him. Allies worshipped him. Commanders used him. And all the while, he remained 17, carrying a weight far heavier than any rifle. Late one night, Lewis asked him quietly, "Does it ever scare you? Knowing the world sees you as something you're not?" Daniel finally answered with words he had never said aloud. "It's not the shot that scares me. It's that they'll forget I'm just a kid." Lewis nodded slowly, saying nothing more. Some truths needed no reply. And so, the legend of the 17-year-old sniper grew, echoing far beyond Afghanistan, beyond the battlefield, beyond Daniel's control. A legend born from a single bullet, one that had broken records but left a boy carrying the unbearable weight of history. The desert night was alive with whispers of wind. Daniel lay motionless in the dust, his cheek pressed against the stock of his rifle, his body hidden beneath layers of camouflage netting and sand. Every breath was measured, controlled, as if even the rise and fall of his chest might betray his presence. The mission had begun at dawn, but hours had stretched into an eternity. Now, long past midnight, his muscles ached from stillness, his eyes burned from staring through the scope. The world beyond his sight blurred into heat shimmers and shadows. Beside him, Corporal Lewis shifted slightly, just enough to whisper, "You good?" Daniel's voice was steady. "I'm fine." Fine wasn't the truth. His body screamed for movement, for rest. His hands tingled from lack of circulation. But this was the discipline he had trained, for the patience of a predator, the endurance of stone. Their target was no ordinary figure. Intelligence suggested a meeting of insurgent leaders was set to occur in a compound on the far side of the valley. If successful, the strike could cripple enemy operations across the region. But to get eyes on the compound, Daniel and Lewis had crawled nearly a mile under cover of night, dragging their gear inch by inch through sand and stone. Now, with the compound in view, the waiting game began. Through his scope, Daniel could see dim lanterns glowing inside mud walls. Figures moved in and out, their outlines distorted by the heat. But none matched the high-value target yet. The order was clear. Confirm the identity, then engage. Until then, they were shadows in the dirt. Hours passed. The desert air grew colder, biting against his skin. Lewis whispered once, offering water, but Daniel shook his head. He couldn't break focus. Not now. Finally, movement. A convoy of trucks approached, headlights cutting across the valley floor. Dust trailed behind them like ghostly banners. The compound stirred with life. Doors opened, men poured out, rifles slung over their shoulders. Daniel adjusted his scope, heart rate steady. His training repeated in his head. Identify, breathe, calculate. Then he saw him. A tall man, wrapped in a black headscarf, surrounded by guards. Photographs from intel briefings flashed through Daniel's memory. This was the one. Lewis's whisper barely carried in the wind. That's him. Confirm? Daniel exhaled slowly. Confirmed. He adjusted for distance nearly. 1,800 meters. Not as far as his record-breaking shot, but the conditions were worse. The wind funneled unpredictably through the valley, and lantern light gave him only partial visibility. One wrong calculation, and the shot would miss or worse, hit someone else. He steadied himself. His finger rested on the trigger. Featherlight, then chaos. An unexpected patrol appeared on the ridge behind them, just silhouettes at first. Daniel froze, praying the camouflage held. The patrol moved closer, their voices carrying in the silence. One wrong step, and the entire mission would collapse. Lewis tensed beside him. What now? He mouthed. Daniel didn't answer. His mind raced. If they were discovered, the compound would scatter before he ever took the shot. The mission would fail, and dozens of insurgents would vanish into the desert. He forced his breathing to slow. Patience, timing. The patrol drew nearer. Daniel's hand drifted to his sidearm, but he stopped himself. Firing would alert the valley. No, he had to wait. He had to trust the darkness. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, the patrol veered off, turning toward another ridge. Their voices faded. Daniel's muscles unclenched, but his heart pounded in his ears. He returned his eye to the scope. The target was laughing with his men, unaware of the near disaster. Lewis whispered, "Take it now." Daniel shook his head. The wind shifted again, tugging at dust across the valley. Too risky. He could feel the numbers in his mind, the bullets. Arc, the second it would take to cross the distance. It wasn't right yet, so he waited. Seconds bled into minutes. Sweat cooled on his neck despite the cold air. His body begged him to move, but his mind was iron. Finally, the wind stilled. A brief, fleeting calm. Daniel exhaled, squeezing the trigger with surgical precision. The rifle bucked softly against his shoulder. The round cut through the night, invisible, silent. One heartbeat. Two. The target staggered, collapsing before he ever understood what had happened. Guards shouted, scrambling for cover. Panic rippled through the compound. Lewis whispered fiercely, "Direct hit. Let's move." But Daniel didn't move. Not yet. He scanned the chaos, ensuring there was no mistake, no second chance needed. Only when the compound erupted fully into disarray did he finally shift. Together, They slithered backward through the dirt, retreating inch by inch, vanishing into the darkness as insurgents fired blindly into the night. Hours later, they reached the extraction point. Exhausted, filthy, they boarded the waiting vehicle in silence. Only when the engine roared to life did Lewis break it. "Kid, that was insane. Do you even realize what you just pulled off?" Daniel leaned his head back, eyes closing briefly. He felt no triumph, no rush of glory, only relief. Relief that the mission had succeeded, that lives would be spared because of one shot. Back at base, reports confirmed the kill. The compound had fallen into disarray, its network shattered. Commanders praised Daniel's composure, his patience, his discipline. But he waved off the praise, focusing instead on cleaning his rifle again, his ritual after every mission. Alone in his tent, he thought back to the patrol on the ridge, the near disaster. He realized how thin the line was between success and failure, life and death. One wrong choice, and none of it would have mattered. For the first time, fear truly settled in. Not fear of dying, but fear of failing the men who trusted him. His legend was growing, but so was the weight on his shoulders. The world saw a prodigy, a record breaker, a hero. Daniel saw something else entirely, a boy forced into silence, patience, and impossible decisions. A boy who knew that every bullet carried not just death, but history. And as he lay awake that night, the desert winds whispering against the canvas of his tent, he wondered how long he could keep carrying that burden before it crushed him. The first notice arrived quietly, via secure email to his commanding officer. Daniel didn't read it himself. His sergeant glanced at the screen and raised his eyebrows. "Hayes," Miller said softly, almost in disbelief. "They're summoning you to D.C., the Pentagon, recognition, awards. You're kind of famous now." Daniel's eyes didn't change. He nodded once. "Famous isn't my job." Miller hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It is now. You can't escape it." The next week passed in a blur. Daniel continued his patrols, continued his missions, but a shadow lingered over every step. Every radio call, every intelligence update reminded him that while he remained hidden in the desert, his name was already traveling thousands of miles beyond the war zone. Finally, orders arrived, travel to Washington, D.C. for official recognition of his record-breaking achievements. The 17-year-old recruit, who had once been mocked in basic training, now prepared to meet generals, politicians, and reporters. The plane ride was silent. Daniel stared out the window at clouds drifting below, the sun glinting off their edges. His mind replayed Afghanistan, the shots, the dust, the screams, the stillness. He wasn't sure he belonged in a room filled with applause and ceremonial lights. Upon arrival, military aides guided him through a labyrinth of security checkpoints and polished marble halls. Every step echoed, reminding him he was no longer just a soldier in the desert. He was a symbol. The ceremony was held in a grand auditorium. Flags lined the stage, and rows of military officers stood at attention. Cameras clicked, recording every moment for national broadcast. Daniel sat quietly, uniform crisp, eyes forward. His face, still youthful, barely betrayed the enormity of the attention around him. A senior general stepped to the podium. "Today, we recognize one of the youngest and most accomplished snipers in the history of the United States military. Sergeant Daniel Hayes, at just 17 years old, has demonstrated precision, patience, and bravery beyond his years. His legendary shot in Afghanistan saved countless lives and shattered previous records. For his actions, we honor him." Applause thundered through the hall. Daniel shifted slightly, but did not rise. His palms were sweaty beneath the formal gloves. He had never sought recognition, had never wanted to be a symbol. He had simply done his duty. Later, reporters swarmed. Questions fired at him from every direction. How did it feel to make history at 17? Were you scared in the field? What was going through your mind before the shot? Daniel answered in short, measured sentences. I did. My job. I focused on the mission. I tried to protect my squad. Some journalists frowned at his lack of flourish. They were searching for sound bites, emotion, inspiration. Daniel had none to offer. His pride wasn't in the kill. It was in survival, in duty, in the men who lived because of his actions. Back at the hotel later that evening, the reality of his new life hit. Media coverage had already exploded nationwide. Headlines hailed him as a teenage hero, an unmatched prodigy, a boy sniper legend. Social media exploded with fan art, memes, and praise. Daniel lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. He felt a strange mixture of numbness and fear. The weight he had carried in Afghanistan now multiplied exponentially. He was no longer just facing bullets. He was facing attention, scrutiny, expectations. And myth. Hey, you okay? Lewis asked, leaning against the doorframe, tired after their long travel. Daniel shrugged. I'm alive. That's all that matters. Lewis sighed. You're carrying more than anyone knows. They see a hero. But you're still a kid, man. You can't forget that. Daniel nodded, quietly. He knew Lewis was right, but a part of him feared what would happen if he let himself feel like a kid again. Fame, history, recognition, it changed the rules. And in war, rules were already dangerous enough. The following days were a whirlwind. He met generals, advisors, and even government officials. They praised him, photographed him, and asked for interviews that seemed endless. He answered politely, giving minimal details. Each word felt carefully measured, a shield against being turned into something he wasn't. He also learned about the broader impact of his actions. His legendary shot had boosted morale across military units. Young soldiers in combat zones were inspired by his example. Units were more disciplined, more determined. News outlets debated his impact, comparing him to historical snipers. He heard stories from far-off bases soldiers, talking about him in hushed, reverent tones, as if he were a ghost who watched over them. Yet for Daniel, the applause was hollow. He missed the stillness of the desert. He missed the simplicity of his rifle, the quiet discipline, the solitude that had defined him for years. Now, cameras and speeches filled the spaces that had once been empty and safe. Late one night, he walked along the reflecting pool near the Lincoln Memorial. The water mirrored the lights of the city, fractured into tiny, trembling pieces. He thought about home Montana, his parents, the snow, the forests, the quiet fields. He longed for the simplicity of those days, when life was about patience, precision, and the calm between heartbeats. A voice behind him startled him. You all right, Hayes? He turned. Miller had flown in with him, standing solid in the moonlight. Yeah, Daniel said finally, though his voice was soft. Just thinking. Miller nodded. The world wants a legend. Don't let it take your soul in the process. You're still you, still that kid from Montana, even if everyone else forgets that. Daniel closed his eyes, breathing deeply. The city hummed around him, full of noise and life. The world had rewritten him, crafted a myth he hadn't asked for. But Miller's words grounded him. The next day, the Pentagon held a formal ceremony. Medals were pinned to his chest. Military brass spoke. Cameras clicked. History recorded every moment. And all the while, Daniel remained quiet, serene, composed. He had become a symbol, yes, but inside, he was still a boy, still a soldier, still the same one who had waited. Silently in Montana fields, learning to breathe, wait, and survive. Afterward, he returned to Afghanistan. The media frenzy had faded from the combat zones, replaced by whispers of respect, awe, and a growing myth. But Daniel returned to his rifle, his scope, his squad. The legend would follow him, but he carried it with the same discipline as his rifle, carefully, deliberately, and silently. He had learned an important lesson in the city of monuments and applause. Being a hero in the eyes of the world was one thing. Being a hero in the eyes of those who depended on him in the desert, that was everything. As he settled back into the dusty routine of patrols, missions, and silent watches, Daniel knew the world now watched him. But he also knew that none of that mattered in the heat of the battlefield, when seconds counted and a single shot could save lives or end them. He was 17, yes. He was a legend, yes. But above all, he was a soldier. And a soldier's duty was always the same: patience, precision, survival, protection. Everything else, the headlines, the glory, the myth, was just noise. And so, Daniel Hayes, the boy sniper, returned to the desert, carrying the weight of legend and the burden of duty together, ready for whatever the war and history would demand of him next. The wind swept across the barren mountains, carrying the bitter taste of dust and gunpowder. Daniel Hayes crouched behind a jagged rock formation, rifle poised, eyes scanning the horizon. Every sense was heightened, the smallest ripple in the thing. Sand, the faintest movement along the distant ridge. The mission was clear: neutralize a high-ranking insurgent responsible for orchestrating multiple ambushes, known only by code name, the Wolf. His heart beat steadily. He had faced impossible shots before, had survived firefights that would have broken men twice his age. But this was different. Intelligence warned of multiple snipers, automated defenses, and traps along every possible route. One mistake would be fatal, not just for him, but for the squad waiting below. Beside him, Corporal Lewis adjusted the scope on his own rifle, whispering updates from the observation post. They're moving. 3 guards ahead, 2 behind. Wolf's in the center. Daniel nodded, lips pressed tight. He had been here before long hours of crawling through dust and shadow, patience stretched to its limit. Every movement had been calculated, every breath measured. This mission would be no different, yet somehow it felt heavier, as if the desert itself bore witness to the stakes. Hours passed. The sun edged higher, shimmering off rocks and sand, creating heat ripples that distorted distances. Daniel adjusted. His calculations repeatedly wind speed, temperature, bullet drop, humidity, even the subtle pull of the earth across miles. Every factor mattered. One miscalculation, and the shot would fail. Finally, the Wolf appeared. A tall man, heavily armed, flanked by guards. Daniel's finger hovered lightly on the trigger, vision locked through the scope. His mind quieted, recalling every lesson from Montana Fields to sniper school, from his first ambush in Afghanistan to the record-breaking shot that had made him infamous. This was it. One shot, one chance, one bullet. The enemy moved unpredictably, guards scanning. In patterns Daniel had anticipated, yet the Wolf shifted his weight, adjusting for cover. Daniel's breath slowed, his heartbeat almost invisible against the wind. He waited for the exact moment when the man was fully exposed, the wind calmed, and every variable aligned. Then he fired. The shot cracked sharply through the valley, echoing against cliffs. The bullet screamed invisibly across the distance, cutting through air and shadow. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the Wolf stumbled, collapsing into the dust. Guards scrambled, disoriented, unable to locate the source. Chaos erupted. Daniel remained motionless, scanning the area, eyes flicking from target to target, ensuring the shot had achieved its goal. When the dust settled, the Wolf was neutralized, his network thrown into confusion, leaving insurgent operations in disarray. Lewis exhaled quietly beside him. Direct hit. You did it. Daniel didn't respond. He packed his rifle slowly, every movement deliberate. Triumph wasn't his priority. Survival was. Duty was. The men below had yet to extract safely. The squad descended through the valley, moving under cover while insurgents fired sporadically, panicked by the sudden loss of leadership. Daniel provided overwatch, each shot calculated, each movement precise, guiding them safely back. It was a ballet of death and survival, silent, deadly, and flawless. When they finally reached safety, Daniel allowed himself a brief exhale, the tension melting slightly from his shoulders. His squad surrounded him, faces filled with relief, admiration, and awe. The young sniper who had once been mocked, the boy who had become a legend in a single shot, had just done it again, saved lives, changed the course of battle, and survived against impossible odds. Back at base, the news traveled fast. Commanders lauded the operation as flawless, attributing success to precise intelligence, bravery, and yes, the skill of one sniper who defied age and expectation. Daniel's record now stood not just as a story of distance, but of endurance, courage, and unerring precision under the most extreme conditions. The Pentagon followed closely, issuing commendations, updating records, and quietly noting that Daniel Hayes had officially surpassed every previous mark in sniper history. The young prodigy had cemented a legacy few could even imagine achieving. And yet, for Daniel, the medals, the headlines, and the praises were secondary. He returned to his routine, the silent hours behind the scope, the careful movements through sand and shadow, the discipline that had carried him from Montana fields to the deserts of Afghanistan. The boy who had pulled his first trigger in fear and determination now understood fully the weight of each life in the crosshairs. Late one night, he sat alone, rifle across his knees, staring at the stars through the tent flap. He thought of home snow-covered forests, quiet streams, and the simplicity of life before bullets, explosions, and legend. He remembered every teacher, every mentor, every squadmate who had trusted him with their lives. And he realized that history had not just recorded his shot, but had quietly demanded that he grow, not into the myth the world adored, but into the man who bore it responsibly. Sergeant Miller joined him, as he often did, sitting in silence beside the boy-turned-soldier. After a long pause, Miller spoke softly, almost reverently. "You've done more than any 17-year-old should have to," he said. "Saved lives, shattered records, carried a burden most men don't even understand. You've earned every bit of respect in the world." Daniel didn't answer immediately. Finally, he spoke, voice quiet but steady. "I didn't do it for respect. I did it because it had to be done. Because they needed someone to wait, to watch, to make the shot when nothing else could save them." Miller nodded. "And that's exactly why you'll be remembered." Daniel considered this. The record-breaking distance, the legendary shot, the fame, the Pentagon recognition, all of it mattered. But what mattered more was the quiet discipline, the patience, and the responsibility he had carried. He realized that being a legend wasn't about the headlines or the medals. It was about integrity, courage, and the ability to act when the world demanded it most. The war continued, as wars always do, but Daniel had crossed a threshold. He was no longer just a 17-year-old recruit. He was the sniper who had redefined what was possible, who had protected his brothers, and changed history with a single shot twice over. And yet, he remained humble, disciplined, and focused. Fame might follow, legends might grow, but Daniel knew that the rifle, the scope, and the patience remained his closest companions. For the boy from Montana, the battlefield taught him more than fame ever could, that precision, duty, and courage define a hero, not applause or headlines. As the sun rose over the desert, painting the mountains with gold and shadow, Daniel prepared for the next patrol. Another day, another mission, another chance to protect those who depended on him. He had become a legend, yes, but he was still a soldier first, and that, he knew, was everything. For Daniel Hayes, the 17-year-old sniper who had broken every record, history would remember the shot, but he would remember the silence, the patience, and the lives behind it. And in that quiet understanding lay the true measure of a hero.